Thanks, Lisa. Welcome back from lunch. Over the past 10,000 years, seed saving was revered as one of the most important acts that a farming community could perform. Seeds had to be protected from weather and pests, and few calamities could be as severe as the loss of a community's seed bank. And even though most Americans have lost touch with this endeavor, it continues to be an honored ritual worldwide. Last fall, I was with a group of Gustavus and Concordia students in India, and we met this woman. She was the community's seed saver, and she could tell us which varieties got planted in soggy or dry ground, when seeds were to be planted, and she also picked the seeds for the next year. She took no money for her services and said, "You do not charge for seeds because they feed the people, their animals, and they provide medicine." In other words, seeds belong to no one, and seeds belong to everyone. What this woman did for her Indian community, our next speaker, Dr. Cary Fowler, is trying to ensure for the world. He is the executive director of the Global Crop Diversity Trust, which funds the Svalbard Global Seed Vault in Norway. The trust collaborates with other seed banks, big and small. Like a modern-day NOAA, the vault has gathered and preserved backup copies of over 500,000 of the world's different varieties of food plants, with the ultimate goal to maintain these copies in perpetuity. But why do we need stewards of seed diversity? First, the reality is we've already lost a significant amount of genetic variation in our food crops. My grandmother grew up with 287 varieties of carrots, and today there are about 21. And in the worst case, this facility, deemed the Doomsday Vault, may be all that stands between us and another Irish potato famine. Today, Dr. Fowler will more fully explain why maintaining genetic diversity and seed banks are important as we aim to breed crops to feed 10 billion people in hotter, much more variable environments. Dr. Fowler's career has spanned over 30 years. He earned his PhD at the University of Uppsala in Sweden, and he told me yesterday that his office overlooked the Linnaeus Arboretum. And his bachelor's degree he earned from Simon Fraser University in Canada. His undergraduate thesis focused on Jean-Paul Sartre's notion of human agency in politics. He grew up in the American South and was strongly involved in the civil rights movement, which deepened his interest in social justice. In the 70s, Fowler began working with Pat Mooney, and together they founded Rural Advancement Foundation International, and Mooney persuaded Cary to direct his political activism toward international food policy matters, specifically toward the UN's Food and Agricultural Organization, or the FAO. The FAO hired Fowler to oversee the first worldwide assessment of genetic plant resources, and the international treaty that grew from this work has been ratified by most countries in the world. He is the author of more than 75 articles on the topics of things like agriculture, law, and development. And he also contributed to a book by another Nobel Conference participant, Francis Moore-Lappé. He has received many awards, notably the Right Livelihood Award, which is considered the alternative Nobel Prize. And this year, he also has received the Heinz Award for his work to protect the world's plants from climate change and natural disasters. This quote by Dr. Fowler highlights a rationale that seems to fuel his mission. To preserve genetic diversity, we must engage in both conservation and politics. As the only species powerful to affect all evolution on the planet, humanity has this responsibility. If we fail, the genetic heritage of 12,000 years will disappear. It is my distinct honor to present Dr. Cary Fowler, the second lecturer of the 2010 Nobel Conference, speaking on food security in a frightening and finite world. Dr. Fowler.
Thank you. Thank you, Pam, and thank you to Gustavus for the privilege of being here. Let me also say thank you to Gustavus for the wonderfully inclusive act of having interpretation for the deaf community. That's very important. And thank you for the interpreter, of course. I can read that. Let's begin a complicated story simply. For all of our iPods and iPhones, for all of our hybrid vehicles and space shuttles and super colliders, for all of our flat screen TVs, for all of our technological wizardry, we still owe our life to a few inches of topsoil, a handful of crops, and an occasional thunderstorm. It's really that simple. And if you're not amongst the billion people on this earth that are hungry, chronically hungry, or on the edge of it, then you are part of essentially the first generation ever to take food for granted. We assume abundance. The question, though, is where did this abundance come from? We're getting an abundance of feedback now. Where did this abundance come from, and are the conditions in place to repeat the feat of the last century, because population is still growing and there's demands due to development? So if you look back historically at where the increased abundance has come from, because it's logical that we assume abundance in a way. In my lifetime, the per capita food availability in the world has grown by 29%. Now, if you live in Africa, the situation is slightly different. Your per capita basis for food just got up to the level that it was in 1960. But globally, it's 29% greater since I came into this world. And historically, the most prominent way of increasing food production has simply been to cut down trees and increase the amount of farmland. From 1700 to the mid-1900s, the population of the world increased fivefold, and so did the amount of land being used for farm. Since the middle part of the last century, we've doubled the amount of land under irrigation and tripled the amount of water being used. Fertilizer use is up 23-fold. Pesticide use up 53-fold. For a brief period of time, we actually invested in plant breeding globally. And we've had a remarkably good, benign climate for the last 50 years. So if you sum all these things up, you use more land, more water, more pesticide, more fertilizer, you have a good climate, surprise, 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 you've produced more food. But the question remains, can we produce more food in the future the way that we produced more food in the past? That's a pretty important question. What we're facing is really, as this slide indicates, a gathering storm. And I want to go down this list and just take a very brief look at the elements that gave us the increased food supply that we've enjoyed in our lifetime. Land. Well, something quite dramatic happened in the mid-1980s, and that is that for the first time, the extra amount of food that was being produced globally was not coming primarily from cutting down trees and clearing land and having more farmland. It was actually coming from the intensification of agriculture. Opening up new lands for production became less and less important. And that historic turning point, historic from the very beginnings of agriculture in the Neolithic era, took place silently without any newspaper headlines in the mid-1980s. Water. Well, agriculture already uses 70% of fresh water supplies. You do have to ask yourself if you think that the proportion of water that agriculture is going to be allowed is going to grow bigger than 70%. I doubt it. We're seriously mining fossil water in our aquifers, and we have a number of examples of what this is doing. Saudi Arabia has now announced that it will cease growing wheat in 2013. Why? Because its aquifers are running dry. So what it's going to do is to import wheat from other countries. But think of it this way. They're essentially importing water. The water that they don't have, which someone else is going to use to grow food, which is going to be imported into Saudi Arabia. There are some 260 rivers, major river systems around the world that flow through multiple countries. So as we look at climate change and as we look at increasing demands for water in order to produce agricultural products, we have to ask ourselves the question of what kind of conflict or tension is going to arise by the fact that these rivers are flowing through multiple countries. Energy. Well, something else happened in the mid-1980s that was quite interesting, and for the first time, consumption of energy was not replaced by discovery of new forms of energy, petroleum I'm talking about. So basically, we started to eat away at that stockpile. There's been no real production increase since 2050, and now the idea of peak oil, which was once an idea ascribed to by sort of the crackpot fringe, is now something that you can find being enunciated by the International Energy Agency, a rather conservative body, by the University of Kuwait, by Oxford University. The debate is not if we're going to peak in the production of oil, the question is when, and the International Energy Agency says that's going to happen between 2010 and 2020. So what we look towards in a food system which is globalized and highly, highly energy dependent is a situation where we should and would like to be increasing food production by twofold by the middle part of this century, and yet we're only going to have the availability of oil that we had in 1960 when the population was just 3 billion people. Of course, the most clear link between energy and food is really the link that occurs when agricultural production, when there's competition and agricultural production is competing between food and fuel demands. Then there's the question of nutrients. That's related to the energy question as well because nitrogenous fertilizers are largely based on natural gas. And of course, if we start to run low on oil supplies or do peak in terms of production, we can expect a rise in natural gas prices, which in turn will cause a rise in fertilizer prices. But perhaps more importantly and more silently, we're facing the loss of one of the key nutrients, and that's phosphorus. All of the projections I see show phosphorus production, for which there's no substitute in agriculture, peaking between 2050 and the end of this century. And finally, we come to climate change, and I want to dwell on this just for a moment. Agricultural crops are at the front line of climate change. When you think about it, what's going to be affected first by climate change? It's going to be the crops in the field. So let me show you a histogram that demonstrates temperatures in South Africa on the left and Peru on the right, chosen more or less randomly. The blue bars indicate a distribution of the average growing season temperature historically in southern Africa. The red is a projection for what the growing season temperatures are going to look like later in the century. And you will notice that there is essentially no overlap. What does that mean? That means that in the future, the coldest growing seasons will be hotter than the hottest growing seasons of the past. Something that the crops have never experienced. Now you can ask yourself, what happened in the previous, what's our experience with these previously hot years. Our experience is disastrous. Our experience in 2003, when Europe had a very hot summer, was that agricultural production in France and Italy went down by 25% or so. In the future, those will be good years. The real question is what's going to happen out here when it becomes truly hot. Now, of course, nobody's going to flip a switch. This histogram is based on 2080 to 2100, and by the way, it's using the mean, the middle scenarios by the IPCC, which a lot of climatologists will tell you are conservative. Nobody's going to flip a switch, and all of a sudden we're going to go from the current climate to this one. What's going to happen is we're going to transition, and if you look at what the transition period looks like just 20 years from now, we're looking at a decline of something like 25% in corn production in southern Africa if the same varieties of corn are in the field then as today. Now, corn accounts for about half the nutrition in southern Africa, so a 25% drop in production, not on a per capita basis, gross, be greater on a per capita basis, is going to mean that we will watch, once again, babies starve to death on TV. This is obviously serious business. Let me show you a couple more ways to look at this particular situation. Here's a world map in some ways that's going to look familiar to those of you who pay attention to climate change topics. And you could be sort of lulled into thinking that the greenish areas on this map are the areas where things aren't going to be so bad. This represents average growing season temperatures in summers from 2040 to 2060, but the green areas indicate that from 10 to 50% of those growing areas are going to be out of bounds. In other words, higher temperatures than ever experienced before in all of the areas colored green on this world map. The areas that are colored with the hotter colors, the yellow, orange, and red, that's where we really have some problems, and that's where more than half, all the way up to 100% of the average growing season temperatures are going to be different than anything ever experienced. If you look at it in terms of individual crops, and this is for sub-Saharan Africa, for maize, sorghum, and pearl millet, here's the percentage of growing seasons that are going to be in bounds. In other words, inside the experience, the historical experience of those crops in Africa. We start off with 100%, that's today. But by 2075, for those three crops, virtually all of the growing seasons are going to be different, hotter than they've ever been before. 20 years from now in southern Africa, 4 out of 10 of the growing seasons are going to be out of bounds. Now, one very simple way of looking at this is that, of course, I've been talking about average temperatures. Yes, the average growing season temperature is going to be much, much warmer. But the problem for the plants is not so much the average. We're also going to be seeing higher extremes. We're going to be seeing longer periods of extreme heat. We're going to be seeing heat coming at the wrong time. During flowering period, for example, when the pollen is extremely vulnerable to sharp spikes in temperature. Once you go over the low 90s in terms of temperature, for many of the major food crops in the world, you're dealing with a high stress situation, which in the case of rice can mean a 10% drop in yield for every 1 degree Celsius increase in temperature. So marginal areas around the world are going to become more marginal. And if you begin to look at where the poverty exists in the world, lined up with the projections of climate change, lined up with what crops they're actually growing, the places that are going to be hardest hit are South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, precisely where the largest numbers of poor and hungry people live. So if you add all these things up, it's tempting to say that, well, look, we're facing peak land, peak water, peak energy, peak nutrients, peak temperatures, peak food. Certainly, any of these challenges would be daunting to try to deal with in agriculture. My fear, frankly, is the combination of those challenges, how to deal with all of those things simultaneously. We're living through, you and I in this room, we're living through in our lifespan perhaps less than 0.5% of the history of agriculture, but I promise you it's going to be the most interesting. It's now evident to me that before we create the kind of society that we want, the kind of society that Frankie and I were talking about in Food First years ago, we're going to run smack dab up against some physical constraints that are not trivial. We do live in a world of limits. We live on a small planet, a finite planet, a plundered planet. And it's obvious that infinite growth, infinite consumption of water, energy, nutrients, and infinite food production is not possible. So we have received the wake-up call. The question is how we're going to deal with it. And unfortunately, I don't have a simple, convincing answer to give you. I work in one small area of agriculture, and I want to spend the rest of my time with you talking about what we're doing. It's not a panacea, but it's one person or a group of people's response. And I want to talk to you about agricultural biodiversity. Now, this is a view of what most people think about as biodiversity and where they fit into it. If you go out on the street and ask people about biodiversity, they talk to you about whales and pandas and tigers and strange flowers in the tropical forest. But the kind of biodiversity that I'm interested in is actually this kind of biodiversity. It's the diversity that exists within species. And interestingly enough, for the biologists out there, of course, this was actually the topic of the first chapter of Darwin's book. Darwin didn't talk about this Rousseau painting. Darwin talked about variation under domestication in the first chapter of his book. And that's what I want to spend some time talking with you about. So, most of us don't know beans about beans, and that's going to be proven in a minute, myself included. Here's a photograph of beans. I love beans. And this is a photograph of about, I don't know, count them quickly, perhaps 40 different varieties of beans. So if I had a photograph just like this, but in every photograph I changed all the bean varieties, it would take about 1,000 photographs to show you the diversity of beans, because there are about 40 to 45,000 different varieties of beans, just as different as a Great Dane from a Chihuahua. Let me run through a few more of these bean photographs, because like I said, I like beans. And of course, this is just the visual diversity. And my favorite one. That's just beans. Then we have potatoes. And then wheat. This is a particularly interesting photograph because this looks like, 7 different varieties of wheat, but actually this wheat was harvested in a single farmer's field. This was his or her variety, actually a genetic population, a lot of diversity in that field. So even the term variety is really not perhaps the appropriate one to use. The point about all this diversity is not that it looks pretty and ought to deserve a place in our world. I believe those things are true. But the point is that these are colors on the artist's palette. This diversity represents everything that agriculture can be in the future. It represents whether we're going to adapt to climate change, the next pest or disease, or not. It's the raw material for plant evolution. Darwin understood that in the mid-1800s. And so when we lose production in our agricultural fields, because we don't use this diversity to create new pest and disease resistant varieties or drought-tolerant varieties, what's actually happening is that we're wasting water, we're wasting energy, we're wasting nutrients. Now, the good news is that we have actually collected a lot of that diversity. There have been such huge changes in agricultural systems in the last 50 years that while much diversity is still grown on the farm, particularly in developing countries, in a lot of cases that diversity isn't found anymore. But the good news is that a fair amount of it has been collected in gene banks. Here's a gene bank more or less down the road from you guys in Ames, Iowa. Gene banks, it's a fancy word for saying a freezer where seeds are stored. And basically, if you want to conserve seeds for a long term, you dry them down to a low moisture content, which reduces their biological activity, and you freeze them, which does the same thing as well. So there are a number of gene banks around the world, and they take all kinds of forms. Here's another one in Botswana. Another one, not sure where it is, but you get the idea that some are pretty fancy and inspire confidence and others don't. And here's a friend of mine named Nestor in the Philippines, and what he's doing is he's at the National Gene Bank of the Philippines, and he's pointing to where the water came up to in a typhoon that struck the Philippines. It put more than a meter, more than 3 feet of water and mud into the National Gene Bank of the Philippines. And the day after that, once the water had receded, this is what the national collection of the Philippines looked like. On that particular day, a number of varieties with a long and rich history, and presumably with hopefully a long future in the Philippines, became extinct, including, I'm sure, this type of maize down here. This is what the sweet potato collection looked like the day after that typhoon. Obviously, some of those varieties were literally swept away. This, I think, is the last chart you have to master in my presentation. And this is a chart which tries to explain why it is we should care about what's going on in the Philippines. It's very tempting for us to say in the United States, well, gosh, who cares that they had a typhoon and lost a lot of varieties in the Philippines? We've got the big National Gene Bank, which happens to be in Fort Collins, Colorado. It's underground, it's safe, and everything's just fine. Well, there are a couple of reasons why we should care, and one is that in a climate-changing world, the traits, the genes that are found in the Philippine Gene Bank may be highly useful to American agriculture in the past, particularly in a case where the varieties in the Philippines are going to be themselves growing in a completely different environment, and vice versa. So we really are, in a way, our brother's keeper, and this is the best example I know of interdependence in the world. I still go to Australia quite a bit, and I've had a number of wheat farmers there say, but Cary, we've got a big gene bank here in Australia, and we've got a lot of wheat in it. And I say, and here's where I draw your attention to this chart, yep, you've got a lot of wheat in your gene bank. You have 3% of the world's total. So in a climate-changing world, if you want to tie your wagon to that star, to say that everything that Australian agriculture and wheat farmers will need in the future is encompassed in the 3% of the global samples that you've got, be my guest. But I don't know any scientist in the world that would feel confident about the wheat industry of Australia based on 3% of the samples of Australia. But when you look at the numbers in this table, representing how big the collections are in major countries of the world, Australia, Brazil, China, India, the United States, for the major crops, wheat, rice, maize, beans, soybeans, you don't see any very big numbers there. And what that means is that not a single country in the world for a single crop is independent in terms of the crop diversity they're going to need. And I'll underscore that when I talk about climate change. Wouldn't be independent even today with no climate change, but certainly not in the future. So a few years ago, several of us got together commiserating about these kinds of things, and we looked particularly at examples such as the Philippines and the loss of diversity. The loss of diversity in my field is not like losing your car keys. This is loss as in extinction. We'll never see that variety again. We'll never see any traits, any particular characteristics that it might have again. And that seemed to be, in the world in which we lived, an unacceptable kind of situation. We looked at 9/11 and we realized that no facility on Earth is really, really safe. We looked at Hurricane Katrina and we thought, gosh, you know, there were a lot of recriminations after that hurricane struck, and the dominant one was, well, the scientists and the governments knew that sooner or later such a hurricane would strike New Orleans, and they knew if it did that the levees wouldn't hold and there would be mass flooding, but they didn't do anything about it. So we asked the question, well, gosh, we know sooner or later one of the big gene banks will, something will happen, and we'll have a mass extinction event for agriculture on a single day, and they're going to turn around and they're going to point to, well, me and a few other people, and they're going to say, well, why didn't you do anything about this? So we began to think of what we could do, and we realized, of course, my gosh, if the government can put so much energy and so much money into saving the Chevy Tahoe from extinction, can't we save wheat? So we had the idea then of building a fail-safe, a sort of an insurance policy, a plan B, if you will, for existing seed banks. And I just want to describe a little bit this particular facility. It's not an answer. I quickly will say that to the kind of problems that I've been talking about, but it's a piece of the answer, a piece of the larger puzzle we're trying to put together. At the Global Crop Diversity Trust, we work with a lot of seed banks around the world, trying to essentially to endow wheat, endow rice, endow corn. And the backup system for that is what I'm going to talk to you about now. Well, you've already got an arrow on your screen. That's good enough. This is where we chose to focus. These are the islands of Svalbard. This is northern Norway there. The Arctic Circle is down here somewhere. So if you want to go to this place where the black arrow is, you fly to Tromsø in northern Norway, which is, I think, about 200 miles above the Arctic Circle. And you get into a jet plane and you fly another hour and a half north to where the black arrow is. It is, here I will not be able to hide some enthusiasm. I'm in love with the place. It's a fascinating and just extraordinarily beautiful, exotic location. I'll show you a few pictures of it. This is a photo I took. It's actually of a glacier. You'll see, I think, in the next photo, close-up of this. Yep. If you and I were standing down at the bottom, we'd hardly be noticeable. That's about 300 yards high, I think. A lot of ice. There are some wildlife. There are reindeer. There are lots of reindeer, Arctic fox, puffins, various things. There is a small Norwegian village called Longyearbyen. where about 1,500 people live. No indigenous people living. Indigenous people have never settled Svalbard. But Norway maintains this small village, which is economically lives about a third on coal mining, believe it or not, a third on research, particularly Arctic research and climate change research, and about a third these days on tourism. Here's a road sign informing you that polar bears can be anywhere. And in fact, the polar bears do outnumber the human beings in Svalbard. So this was the idea we had, to build a facility inside a mountain in Svalbard. And the logic of that was we wanted to get away from the real dangers of the world. The dangers could be human-induced dangers. A number of gene banks in the last couple of years have been destroyed. Rwanda, Burundi, Solomon Islands, Iraq, Afghanistan. You can guess why all of those were destroyed. Accidents and, of course, bad weather like typhoons in the Philippine case. So we wanted to get away from the human dangers and also the physical, natural dangers. And if you're going to conserve seed for a long time, it needs to be frozen. And so we wanted also to mitigate the problems associated with equipment. So we needed a place that was naturally frozen. And all of these things we get in Svalbard. It's safe. Back in the seed vault area that I'll show you in just a second, it's about -4.5 Celsius, and we mechanically lower it to about -18. But it's far away from the dangers of the world. On the other hand, it's accessible, and the Norwegian village of Longyearbyen has quite a remarkable infrastructure for being where it is. This is not just an idea, it's actually now a reality. To give you a sense of scale, here's a photograph of what the seed vault looked like while it was under construction. And I can tell you it was not easy to construct. A rather small number of workers constructed this facility, really about 20 people. There is in Norway a law that says that if you're going to make a public building, it needs, I think, 2% of the budget has to go to artistic work. This was a little bit challenging in Svalbard as to what that was going to be. But what we did was commissioned a woman to make a it doesn't show up here, but a nice light that goes here and here. You're going to see it in a couple of the other photographs. And I'm reminded of that because these workers, when this woman showed up in the middle of January, which is totally pitch black dark, the sun does not come above the horizon in January, and it's blowing like this, and it's the coldest you can ever imagine being. And this woman showed up, they were a bit skeptical. I can tell you that after the week she spent on top of this facility in blowing winds, they speak with her with a high degree of reverence. There were also some polar bear visits during that period of time, so you really got to watch out. And in the darkness with the wind blowing, they have all the advantages. So here's the facility sort of in situ in its environment. I think you can see why I would be in love with this. Another shot. Yet another one. Some reindeer. And here's the front door, and there you can see the artist's light. Her idea, by the way, was to make a light that would reflect the environment in the Arctic summer. No lighting, artificial lighting being used at that time. But in the Arctic winter, small LED lights would be under these plates, and as she said, it would glow and be a beacon to the world. The facility we worked at the Global Crop Diversity Trust with with the government of Norway and the engineers and architects quite a lot with this. I can't say enough about the partnership we've had with the government of Norway. If you don't mind, let me just tell you a tiny story about that. I chaired the committee that international committee that designed this facility or did the feasibility study for it. And at the end of that process, went to see a vice minister in Norway. Obviously, at the ministerial level in a government, they're not experts on seeds or genetic resources, so I gave my presentation, and he looked at me kind of quizzically, and he said, Dr. Fowler, he said, do I have you right that this diversity you want to conserve up there is the most important, valuable natural resource on Earth? I said, well, yes, I think that's true. And he nodded. He said, and are you telling me that Svalbard is the best place to do it? And I said, well, yes, actually. And he said, how can we say no? I'm not sure that's how decisions are made in Washington, but it seemed very refreshing to me. The facility cost $9 million to build, and Norway paid every last cent of it. That is, by any stretch of the imagination, the world's cheapest insurance policy. But I want to give you a little tour. So we're going to open the door here. And when you open the door, you go down into a tunnel. It's, I think in meters, sorry, but it's about 130 meters straight into the mountain. You're passing through permafrost. It's chiseled out of solid stone. You'll pass through a couple of doors, including this one that you see at the bottom here. And this was from the opening day when we had some fancy lighting and people were carrying seeds in. This is my friend Ola Vestingen. And that's the next to the last door that you go through to get into the actual seed vault. You can see it's beginning to get cold. And when you walk in, well, you wouldn't think that a bunch of boxes on shelves would be very exciting, but when I walk in there, I think it's quite an emotional experience. There is more agricultural biodiversity in this one room than any place on planet Earth. We now have 526,000 samples, 526,000 different varieties. That's like the Great Dane and the Chihuahua. Each sample is about 400 to 500 seeds. What you see right here in front of you, by the way, is the collection from Canada. That's here. The largest collection that we have is of rice, 80,000 different varieties of rice. And here's a collection mainly of wheat and legumes and such. This is just another picture to give you an idea of what it looks like inside. As I've tried to emphasize, as important as this facility is, and I don't want to downplay that, I can't think of any facility that's been built in my lifetime or yours with the kind of time horizon that this has. Maybe the people who built the pyramids thought that it was going to last forever, hundreds or thousands of years, but this facility could easily be here thousands of years from now, and the expected lifespan of some of the seeds in this facility are, in fact, in the thousands of years. The way we run this facility is that it runs just like your safety deposit box at the bank. Norway or the trust where I work, we don't own the seeds, we don't access them, we don't even open the box. Believe it or not, I've never seen a seed in Svalbard. Never actually seen a seed. They're all inside these boxes, I know that. And they're inside aluminum foil packages inside the boxes, but we don't open the boxes and we don't open the packages. Those seeds belong to the depositing agencies and are available only to the depositing agencies. So if the United States or Canada or Kenya or Pakistan deposit seed in Svalbard, those are owned by those countries. And if they lose their seed collection through a natural disaster or war or whatever, we'll happily ship it back to them. The cost of doing this is borne entirely by the organization I work for and the government of Norway. We don't need any other funding. And the cost to the depositors is zippo, zero, nada. It's free. As I mentioned, we have about 526,000 samples. I think when the job is done, we'll be over a little bit over 1 million. What is this all about? I think it's really about this woman. And let me tell you a quick story about her. I spent a day with her in a field outside of Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, a couple of years ago. This woman is a Lathyrus farmer. She farms grass pea. And this is my favorite crop. It's a wonderful legume, perhaps the highest protein content legume in the world. It's the most drought-tolerant legume. It fixes nitrogen, doesn't need fertilizer, highly resistant to pest and disease, can even withstand floods, but its real claim to fame is it's drought-tolerant. And in Ethiopia, that's pretty important. So if you're a farmer there, you want some Lathyrus in your field because if everything else fails, you have a complete crop failure with your other crops, which, by the way, are also drought-tolerant. Lathyrus is going to keep growing, and it will save your life. The downside of Lathyrus is that it has a neurotoxin. And if it's the only thing that you're eating because you're the poorest of the poor, and like this woman, you can't go down the street to the supermarket because you have no money and there is no supermarket, you will survive, live or die because you eat this crop. But if you eat it for very long and exclusively, which would be the situation in a drought or a famine in Ethiopia, you will become paralyzed for the rest of your life. And to me, this symbolizes why we're doing the work that we're doing to conserve crop diversity. Because it is an absolutely immoral and unjust situation that some of the poorest people in the world are faced with the choice of dying of starvation or becoming paralyzed. How does crop diversity fit into this picture? There are low toxin varieties of this crop. If we can manage to collect those, conserve those, get them into the hands of farmers for their own breeding work, get them into the hands of scientific plant breeders, it would be possible for this woman to have the best of all worlds, a crop that saves her life but doesn't paralyze her. This is what Darwin had to say about what I think we're up to. It's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one that's most responsive to change. What we're facing now is a historically unprecedented combination of challenges, and the challenge for us, our own species, is how we're going to respond. Are we going to get agriculture ready for climate change and for the other challenges that face it? The conclusion is not foregone. Other societies have failed, and let me just show you this picture. I'm sure there's someone in the audience that knows where this was taken, and with apologies, this is one of the few places that I could actually show this photograph, and it be very appropriate. This photograph is taken of the Norse settlement in Greenland. This was a church. The last wedding ceremony was held in this church in 1408. The Norse, you know if you've read your Jared Diamond, were also facing climate change. They could have adapted to climate change by learning from the native people how to build kayaks and how to fish, but they didn't want to do that. They wanted to continue to raise cattle. But that wasn't so easy because the winters were getting longer and the summers shorter, and they couldn't grow enough grass to overwinter the cattle. So that society, deciding that it didn't want to adapt to climate change, well, climate change adapted to it, and now we go and look at the ruins. You'll be interested to know, apropos the name of this college, that the man down in the corner here is King Carl XVI Gustav, the current king of Sweden. I spent a week with him touring around Greenland a few years ago, looking at how societies either did or did not adjust to climate change. And obviously, this was a failure to adapt. The same fate, of course, could befall us if we're not careful. To me, conserving crop diversity, breeding, agricultural research, these are not answers to all of our problems, but they're the three least painful kind of responses we could make to climate change. And they're least disruptive, they're least taxing on our lifestyles, and they're least expensive. And if we can't do these things, frankly, we're not committed to change at all. It seems to me that climate change is frankly a national security issue, and we ought to treat it that way. Climate change is going to kill far more people than Al-Qaeda is going to kill. And so we really have to get ready. Conserving this diversity is not a prerequisite for or it's not a solution to all our problems, as I've been saying, but it is a prerequisite. I cannot imagine constructing an efficient, sustainable, effective response to climate change without conserving crop diversity. Now, in ending, I know that some of you will think, well, gosh, that guy has just given a pretty depressing, pessimistic lecture. How's he going to get himself out of this? I'm thinking about that myself. And I think the only thing I can say is that, for me, depressing is sitting in a car where something really bad is happening, and you're pumping the brakes and trying to steer, and nothing is happening. Nothing is happening because you're not the driver, you're the passenger. That, to me, is depressing. So if I were giving a commencement address, and there are a lot of students in the audience, so I can pretend for a while, I would say this. If you want to be bored and depressed, you don't have to do anything. It'll come naturally. But I think that you in this audience are actually a different kind of people. I think in my small amount of time here that it seems like you're learning this wonderful truth that Einstein once muttered, that not everything in life that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. So late at night, when you're all alone with your thoughts, and you're wondering about what you're doing with your life or what you have done with your life, I'd like to say that I don't think you're going to condemn yourself if you fail. Success is not guaranteed. I think you will condemn yourself if you don't try. The problems that I've outlined today are problems that I believe can be solved. I am, in fact, optimistic. But it will take a few people doing their part to solve them. So my advice to you is to be a part of that few. It's fun. Thank you very much.
Go ahead and get started. If you would like, raise your hand if you're taking questions so questioners can hand their questions to you. Chuck, where are you? There's, and Jim. Here our group. First off, questions from the panelists. Would anyone like to ask a question? Yes,
I've
Marion.
got one. I have a technical question.
There.
I've been to several seed banks, and they all have programs for growing the seeds and making sure that the seeds are still viable. I didn't hear anything about that, or did I miss that? I mean, I can understand that they're frozen, and you hope that they'll survive freezing for 1,000 years, but do you do anything to test viability? That would be a very big job with that number of seeds.
Yeah.
You'd need a big garden.
It would be.
And I don't know if Svalbard would do it.
No. You didn't miss it. I missed it. I should have explained a little bit more clearly. What we've tried to do in Svalbard is to construct a seed vault. We don't call it a gene bank or a seed bank, that has the best conditions, best conservation conditions possible. And that means that no gene bank in the world has better conditions. And that means that the seeds do not deteriorate more quickly in Svalbard than they would in the normal gene bank. So what happens is that the normal gene bank has the responsibility. It is, after all, their seed collection that we're safeguarding as an insurance policy. So they have the responsibility for periodically testing the viability, the germination rate. When it drops to a certain point, they will take some seeds out themselves, multiply them, get fresh new seed, and when they do that, they'll send us more.
Others. Bina.
Yeah, I thank you for a really wonderful, wonderful talk. I had three sort of interlinked questions. Since there's shortage of space, I mean, everything costs, and this wonderful vault that has been created, and you leave it to countries to decide what's going to be stored there. But what is a system within countries that would ensure that what's stored is really valuable? Because, for instance, the International Rice Research Institute, which has a huge gene bank, makes sure that the varieties that are stored there are genetically different, so that it is indeed biodiverse. Whereas here, it wasn't clear to me what the system was. The second was, would you conceptualize globally a system of interlinked vaults, if you like? Because there'll be local efforts, like the International Rice Research Institute. There are others. There's Costa Rica, where there's also preservation going on. And do we interlink those? And the third is really that if this is global wealth, which indeed it is, and it's the wealth for future generations, what is the system we have in place for sharing? So if the idea is that with climate change, gene varieties that are being grown in, say, Ethiopia may be useful in Australia, then it doesn't really belong to an individual country. And we need some sort of global systems in place to say, yes, this is global wealth, and this is the method by which we'll share it. So I wanted your comments on that.
Okay, I'll try. The first question was, well, which seeds do we put up there? And the answer to that's pretty simple at one level, and that is that we ask countries to send us anything that's not already there. We do have a huge amount of space. We have 3 vault rooms. You might have noticed that from the drawing. And each one of those rooms can conserve about 1.5 million samples. That's a bit more for each room than I think exists in the entire world right now. So we have 3 times as much space as I think we could even possibly need. So in other words, we can make some mistakes. Countries can send us the 2nd or 3rd copy that we already have, and it's not a big deal for us. We simply want to get the maximum amount of diversity up there. We do envisage a system of seed banks around the world, and the trust where I work is, I think fair to say, predominantly responsible for trying to put that system together. And that system encompasses some of the facilities that you mentioned, such as the one in the Philippines with rice. And our idea is that each unique sample really ought to be in a minimum of 2, possibly 3 different places. Because while we view the seed vault as a backup or an insurance policy for the normal seed banks, in another way, the seed banks are a backup policy for Svalbard. It goes both ways. So we've actually created an endowment fund, and we are permanently endowing these collections as you would endow a chair at a university. So I can tell you that, for example, for $40 million one-off, we could conserve the biological diversity of rice in perpetuity. So we know how to do that. We're trying to put that system together. It's not the sexiest thing to try to sell in Congress when they're trying to conserve the Chevy Tahoe, as I mentioned, but we're plugging away. And I guess the answer to your third question is, well, what kind of system exists for sharing this? And I do believe in my heart that this is a common heritage of humankind. Many of our crops originated prior to the development of the nation state. It's always seemed to me as somewhat arrogant that a nation state would claim responsibility for crops that existed before that state came into being. But we do desperately, in an interdependent, climate-changing world, need a system for sharing. And we basically have such a system. There is an international treaty at FAO. More than 125 countries, I believe, at last count, are members of that treaty, and it lays out a system of common guidelines for how this kind of diversity will be shared and made available to everyone. We're going to have to wait to see how well it works. It's like all other treaties. Sometimes some parties to the treaty are observing it more faithfully than others, but it's a starting point. If you look at this very historically, you have to bear in mind that essentially people have been fighting over diversity since the colonial days. And we are now entering a period where fighting over this kind of diversity is a luxury we can't afford, and we have to learn to be more cooperative.
Heather, yes, Francis.
Cary, that was a fantastic presentation. I learned so much, and
you know where it started.
yes, and I'm very proud to say that we worked together 35 years ago. My questions are two, and they're related. I wonder how you can help me understand the fear that I've heard from some quarters, given what you said about how the people who contribute to this creation that you're responsible for, they retain control of it. So where is the fear coming from that I'm hearing of that the private corporation will get their hands on this and make corporate profit from it? And the second and related question is, how does this connect to the patenting of seeds? If you're saying that the public, the country, is offering this, then how do seed patents come into play here?
Yeah. Okay. Well, those are complicated questions, frankly. So let me try. I think one of the things that I've learned working on this seed vault is that the internet gives voice and audience to a lot of strange people. So anything, think about it, anything that involves a facility that looks like it came out of a James Bond movie, that far north, built in the middle of a mountain, surely there must be a deeper story, right? So I've heard all kinds of things. I was telling somebody yesterday that the most amazing conspiracy story around the seed vault is that it's actually a secret NATO facility. And that half of the Norwegian population is going to be put down there, and then something terrible is going to happen outside, and we're going to repopulate planet Earth from the seed vault.
Pod people.
And now I just want to be honest with you. I spent a lot of time down there. And so I figured I'd have maybe ticket number 1, and I could get in. But I also will inform you that there is only one chemical porta potty down there, and there's no running water. And so I'm going to take my chances on the outside. It's the long and short of that one. There are, of course, a lot of stories about corporate involvement in that. So let me be as clear as I can be. There hasn't been any corporate involvement in the design, conceptualization, design, funding, or use of that facility. There's not a single seed in the seed vault that was placed there by a private company. That doesn't mean I would be against that, I must be honest, but there has been none to date. Norway is a rich country and a generous country, and they didn't need outside funding to build a $9 million facility. So I understand that there are a lot of passions about the private sector and its involvement in agriculture, but we live in a world where both the private sector and the public sector and farmers need access to plant breeding materials, and I don't think personally that the way to address the issues that some people have with private sector involvement is through limiting access to genetic resources any more than I think it's to limiting access to libraries and who can borrow books if we don't like what we think they're going to do with the knowledge from those books. I think there are better ways of dealing with our social problems and our political disputes. That doesn't stop people from painting a lot of conspiracy theories about this facility, but without, I just urge people, if you go on the web and you see these kinds of things, do due diligence and look a little bit beyond the rhetoric. The intellectual property issue is a terribly, terribly difficult one. I'm against, with some passion, the locking up of biological diversity either through sort of mechanical means, national political monopolies. My country has important biodiversity. I'm not going to share it with anybody else, as well as through legal means. And one of the things that I think the international treaty does, and does well, is to recognize that the intellectual property rights laws are going to exist. They do exist in most countries. And so the question is not whether you're for or against them. The question is how you're going to generate and apportion benefits based on those laws. So, for example, the treaty allows access, but it also mandates benefit sharing. So if you make a product with what you've accessed, you will be liable for benefit sharing, which in turn will go back into conservation utilization projects. That's a kind of a complicated answer, and I apologize to some people in the audience that obviously are not following the details of this international treaty, but it has been a step forward, I think.
Thank you. Paul.
I was just wondering if you could say a bit about how I think I understand the rationale for these seed banks as insurance policies, but I was wondering if you could say a word about the importance of continuing to conserve diversity as it exists in farmers' fields for land races and in natural centers of diversity, and also your thoughts on the extent to which that's even feasible in an era of climate change.
Right. I don't see there are some people who take a fairly simplistic approach to conserving crop diversity, and they're either for saving it in gene banks or for saving it on farm, but not both. Why wouldn't we be for both? I'm for both. But I do acknowledge, and I think your point is good, that the diversity that's being conserved as a byproduct of agricultural production, poor farmers in developing countries aren't museum keepers. They're trying to grow food for their families, and as a byproduct of that, they conserve a lot of diversity. But I am worried that in a quickly changing environment, those land races, those farmer varieties, in many cases will be at a disadvantage in the production system. And that we're going to see the most vulnerable people on earth, some of the subsistence farmers, under a great deal of stress because of this. One of the things I think we're going to have to do in the future, and it relates to your question, is to try to find and conserve the wild relatives of some of our agricultural crops. They're going to become extinct at the same rate as our natural plant diversity, according to the IPCC. And it's going to be very useful. I'll just give you one example. If you have rice that loses 10% of its yield for every 1 degree change in temperature during the flowering period above a certain threshold. Well, there's no such thing as a heat-resistant gene. Heat affects rice and other plants in a lot of different ways. But one way it affects it is through the pollen. Most of our modern rice varieties, interestingly enough, bloom at about 11 o'clock in the morning. That's the average blooming time, and the flower opens up. The hottest period of the day is about to come. But if you look at the wild relatives of rice, there's some that open up at 5 o'clock in the morning and others at 11 o'clock at night. You can begin to see then the value of having diversity and not losing it.
Anyone else on the panel? We have a question actually that comes from a high school in Vietnam where they are watching the conference. And that question is, the Mekong Delta of Vietnam is a fertile agricultural area. Citrus trees, bananas, other fruits and vegetables could grow in individual and community gardens. What suggestions can you offer the Tin Hau School to encourage children and parents to recognize the nutritional value and other values of the locally grown fruits and vegetables?
Oh, what a great question.
That is a great question, and thanks for asking it. But I think I want to pass that one to some of the other panel members who I think are probably better able to.
Talk about it from the biodiversity perspective to start.
Well, from that perspective, Vietnam is a truly, truly rich, exciting country for rice, and that's where you see the evidence of the coevolution of people and plants. That diversity in Vietnam owes to a very rich and long human and cultural history in that country. So one of the things I believe that really needs to be done in areas like this that are so rich in terms of biodiversity is to understand that linkage between human cultures and plants, and to celebrate that diversity, i.e. celebrate the cultures, and try to strengthen those linkages. I think there are many, well, I don't want to speak too long, but there are many examples around the world where I think people are waking up to the fact that if you want to value and honor your own cultural traditions, you can, in many ways, most effectively do that through food.
Any other panelists want to speak to that question? Well, I'll dip into the questions from the internet then. Here is, what factor or factors, including the U.S. Supreme Court's decision that life forms are patentable, exert the most pressure toward a reduction in diversity of life forms?
Well,
in 20 words or less.
Yeah, if I look at it at the farm level, I think it's simply the modernization of agriculture and the usually somewhat unintended consequence that we have a homogenization of varieties at the farm level because of that.
Okay, thanks. Can you please comment on the amount of water devoted to food-based agriculture, for example, vegetables, and compare that to what's used for livestock?
Not really. I don't think I know the data on that well enough. I know that the most efficient use of water and irrigation in terms of food value is actually through vegetables. Mm-hmm. And of course, once we run the grain through animals, it becomes a rather water-intensive system.
Looking at the apple on the screen, I was wondering, how does one preserve diversity of plants like apples that do not do well growing from seed? And here the story of the Russian seed bank might come in.
Yeah. Thank you for reminding me. There are a number of crops. I should have mentioned this. There are a number of crops whose diversity you can't or don't want to save in a place like the seed vault or in any other seed bank. You can't save banana diversity that way, for example. Coconuts, a few other crops, and you don't want, for various reasons, to conserve apples that way. So you do it in a field gene bank, or perhaps through tissue culture or cryopreservation, but most often you deal with it through a field collection. Let me just quickly mention that the largest field collection of fruits and berries in Europe, perhaps in the world, is today under threat in Russia, outside of St. Petersburg. And it's threatened by an interesting law that allows a housing foundation to come in and literally seize land, government land, that is not being, quote unquote, efficiently used. A collection of 600 different varieties of apples and 1,000 varieties of strawberries, and one of the world's premier collections of black and red currants and other berries is not efficient use according to this law. So we're in a legal struggle with this foundation that wants to bring in the bulldozers. And if they do that, it'll be the single largest act of mass extinction in my professional lifetime. We'll lose more than 5,500 different varieties of fruits and vegetables. There were in Russia, the old Soviet Union, back in the World War II days, people, about a dozen of whom, that worked at this research station who literally lost their lives protecting this collection. They did it voluntarily. They had those collections, and in the midst of the horrible Nazi siege of Leningrad over 900 days, they refused to eat the collections because they realized that that diversity was going to be necessary to reestablish agriculture in the Soviet Union after the war. The rice curator, the person who was in charge of the rice collection, died with bags of rice on his desk of starvation. So these collections have survived the Nazis, they've survived the Soviet Union, but the question is, are they going to survive the developers? And so do go to our website and take a look at this. The campaign is a political one now. We have to convince the president of Mexico to spare this collection.
Russia.
Russia. Not Obama.
And not Mexico. Who in a country that has experienced an environmental disaster owns their seed supply? Is it the people or the government?
Yeah,
Well, typically, the farmers own their own seed supply, but there are laws in place, this is getting kind of complicated, in a number of countries that would specify that while the farmers own the seed, the country owns the genetic resource. I don't want to go too far in that because that's really getting detailed. But most countries do have national gene banks. Most are frankly of poor quality, and you wouldn't want to store your kids' school lunch in them. No.
If we're interested in getting involved in this effort on a career level, what should we be doing to prepare?
Well, when I got involved in this, I had no idea I was going to do this, and when Frankie and I were working on this book, I think I was unemployed a fair amount of the time after that.
So unemployment is a good preparation?
Unemployment, you can do anything you want. I just thought I would be lucky to have a job. I don't think there's, when I look at what I do now, there is a component of genetics, agronomy, there's a heavy component of law. It pays to have some experience with communications and history, et cetera, et cetera. So I think you have to start in one of those places and expand outward. Mm-hmm. And so in a very real sense, I think that's why students come to this college.
Well, what an endorsement. I'm looking for my handler, Chuck, to see if we should be, we're okay on time? We're okay on time, he's telling me. Here's a question about seeds from countries that are caught in conflict, such that, did I say seeds from countries that are caught in conflict, such that the whole process of voluntary submission might be a fairly low priority? Are there efforts to collect seeds from those sorts of places?
Yes, there are. And one of the fascinating things was that on the day that we opened the seed vault, which was almost 3 years ago, there were 2 countries that were figuratively banging on the door to get their seed collection into the seed vault. And those two countries were Kenya and Pakistan. And if you think back on what was happening almost 3 years ago in Kenya and Pakistan, you'll realize why the managers of those gene banks wanted their materials in Svalbard. Because they realized very painfully that their collections were in danger. Otherwise, we were going first, logically, to the big gene banks to get as much diversity as possible in, but some of the other countries really, really wanted their materials in. So it's very pleasing to me to walk down the shelves at -18 and see those boxes from Kenya and Pakistan, because I have a feeling that no matter what happens in those countries, you know, that seed is going to survive.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. I think we'll have to close there, but I want to invite you to partake of refreshments outside, and be sure to be back for our 3 o'clock lecture. Thanks. Thanks, Professor Fowler.